The 670cc Predator-powered 1969 Renault will be taking a short break this week as we wait for the parts needed to repair the little V-twin engine. So let's do something different, and I'll take you on a mechanical journey. Well, it's more like an adventure as I try to put this shabby-looking vintage Chevy S-10 back on the road. Now, as you can see, I've made some progress and the truck actually moves under its own power, but it wasn't easy, and anything worth doing is never easy. So here's my story. Well, this is what I started with. You know, at first glance it doesn't seem like much, and the truth is, it isn't. This is a simple no-frills pickup truck that used to be common back in the day. You know, trucks like this pint-sized Chevy have become extinct, and dinosaur-sized trucks are thriving. It makes you wonder what's going on in this crazy world we live in. This 35-year-old truck still has a giant fan base, and parts are plentiful both new and used, so it seemed reasonable to be on the lookout for one of these gems. Unfortunately, these trucks do rust, and finding a rust-free example is not easy in my area. Now, this truck is a little beat up, but as you can see, there's zero rust in the cab corners and the rocker panels. Yeah, that fender has some problems, but it ain't rusty. Oh, yeah, it seems like the tires have seen better days. Now over on this side of the little pickup, things are looking a lot better. A few bruises, some chip paint, but we still don't see any rust. And that's because this truck spent most of its life in the low deserts of California. So basically it's a desert truck, which is a great starting point. Now inside the cab, well, it turns out that the desert heat and the harsh UV rays have taken their toll and the interior has seen better days. And that's kind of a problem because I do like a clean interior. The good news is everything that's NFG or FUBAR can be replaced, with the exception of the dashboard, although they do make an ABS cover that can be fitted over the cracked dash padding. I think so far we've seen a few red flags, but overall it seems like the perfect truck to put back in service. We do have one huge red flag that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is this truck can run on regular gasoline or natural gas. The good news is the fuel injection for the gasoline system still kind of works, and the natural gas stuff is completely FUBAR, and at least to me that's good news, because I have no intention of repairing the natural gas garbage. And before some of you lose your minds, keep in mind this truck no longer has the CNG tanks, and sourcing new ones would not be in the budget. Plus, there's zero documentation available on the existing CNG system. So the best and cheapest solution is to pitch the CNG system and to get the truck running again on its original but somewhat antiquated TBI fuel injection system. Now, under the hood, we finally have some good news, and that is you're looking at a 4.3-liter big block V6. Well, for a V6, this engine certainly has a bigger engine block, but as most of you folks know, this generation of the 4.3-liter engine is actually based on the 350 small block Chevy engine. So basically, it's a tree fitty with 2 cylinders lopped off. I realize this isn't the lawnmower type engine that most of you folks are used to in my videos, but in its new life, this truck needs a big engine, and big engines need love too. Yeah, right away you can see the natural gas stuff rearing its ugly head, and it only gets worse. Over on this side of the engine bay, we have more thingies, relays, valves, and whatnot, and no documentation on how any of this stuff works or how it's laced into the wiring harness. It's a complete mess, and most of this stuff is aged out and would be in need of replacement anyway. The best plan is to pitch it all and focus on repairing the simple TBI fuel injection system. And best of all, there's plenty of documentation on the older GM fuel injection systems. Now, since we're on the subject of red flags, here's another one that I was fully aware of when I purchased the truck. I don't know, can you guys smell that? Yeah, that's stinky, nasty gasoline. Now, future Jimbo's telling me that this is going to be a huge problem, and we'll revisit this later in the video. So the first order of business is going to be getting rid of all the junk that isn't original to the truck and getting the engine to run properly on this ancient TBI system. Fast forward a few hours and I've made some progress. As you can see, I've surgically removed most of the crazy contraption that allows this vehicle to run on basically farts. This stuff was laced into the electrical harness pretty deep, and now we have a few loose wires that need to be sorted out. Some of this stuff is easy, and some of it will require a deep dive into the schematic. Now, over here is an example of a temporary fix I did to restore the fuel injectors. Now, once I removed the CNG harness, this circuit was basically wide open and no power was getting to the injectors. Like I said, this is just temporary, and I will repair the original harness once I figure everything out. Okay, at this point, I figured it would also be a good idea to drain the fuel tank and put some fresh gasoline in it. The fuel that's coming out doesn't look terribly bad, but it stinks to no end. Now, this gas is no good for the truck, but it'll be perfectly adequate for the lawnmower. Briggs & Strattons will run on pretty much anything, including this stuff. Okay, fast forward a little bit more, and now we can see if the engine will actually run with all the CNG stuff removed. Well, it started, and that's a good sign. The engine sounds okay, but it doesn't run good. Anyway, both sides of the TVI seem to be working, and at this point, we actually seem to be making some progress. As I move the truck out of the sunlight and into the shade, I can tell that it's running on 5, possibly 4 cylinders. Now, when I was poking around under the hood, I did see that most of the spark plug wires are due for replacement, so we have a few more things to look into. So now we have a poorly running truck with obvious signs of deferred maintenance. Well, it's time to fire the parts cannon and see what happens. Since this truck is a keeper, I wanted to use quality parts, and in my opinion, the AC Delco stuff is questionable. Now, at one point, AC Delco was the go-to brand for servicing a GM vehicle, but nowadays this stuff is imported from the Far East, and based on other items I have from that region of the world, well, quality is always suspect. Now, I have no evidence this stuff is junk, and it's probably okay, but paying a premium for stuff that I thought was American made, and then finding out it was imported, well, that was a real disappointment. The NGK wires and the NTK oxygen sensor are Japanese brands, and I've always had good luck with them, but times are changing, and it seems like everything turns to crap eventually. Let's see how the engine runs after a complete tune-up. Well, it starts a lot faster now. Despite the fact that it sounds okay on video, the engine isn't running right and I can still hear a cylinder missing. Now, this truck is way too old and can't be connected to a modern OBD2 diagnostic tool, and that sucks, but it's not the end of the world. So in order to validate each of the sensor signals are making it to the ECU, every wire had to be ohmed out. Now, once the wires were confirmed good, then I had to use the DVM to measure the voltage of each sensor to confirm the sensor was working. The good news is the engine harness was successfully repaired and all the signals are reaching the ECU, but I still had a misfire. Now, the previous owner did mention he had adjusted the valve lash in an attempt to get the engine to run better, so I went ahead and checked the compression on all the cylinders and found that this cylinder had no compression. So after adjusting the valves with the engine running, I was able to get this cylinder to fire again, and now it shows decent compression. Of course, all the valve lash on this side of the engine was checked, but I didn't bother to check the other side, well, because the previous owner didn't touch those. Now the engine is running on all 6 cylinders at idle, but that's not the end of the story. Nope, we're only halfway done at this point. The oxygen sensor that I purchased for this rig was made for a 1989 Chevy S-10 with a 4.3-liter engine, and that checks out because this is in fact an 89 S-10 with a 4.3. Now, the manual states that on an 89 S-10 with a 4.3, the oxygen sensor is located on the left side exhaust manifold. But that's when we encounter a problem. You see, when they did the CNG conversion on this truck, well, the truck was already 5 years old at the time, and whoever did the conversion updated the exhaust system. Probably a California thing. Anyway, they ended up putting a 94 S10 exhaust system on this 89 truck, and on the 1994 S10 exhaust system, the oxygen sensor is located here. Now, this is a problem. The correct oxygen sensor for a 1989 Chevy S-10 is a single wire sensor, And what that means is this sensor doesn't have a heater in it. Now, the reason it doesn't have a heater is the sensor is intended to be mounted on an extremely hot exhaust manifold, and the heat from the manifold keeps the sensor hot enough to accurately measure the oxygen in the exhaust system. Now, when the sensors move to a remote location like here, well, believe it or not, there just isn't enough heat in the exhaust to allow the sensor to work correctly. And in applications like this, the sensor must have an electric heater in it. So I picked up a Denso 4-wire sensor, and I'll explain why I went with a 4-wire instead of a 3-wire in a few moments. Anyway, the signal generated by this 4-wire sensor is exactly the same as the signal generated by the single-wire sensor. Actually, this sensor may be slightly more accurate, but as you can see, the connectors are vastly different. So updating from a single-wire narrowband sensor to a 4-wire narrowband sensor is actually more common than you may think, and special harnesses are available from various sources. I picked this harness up off eBay for like $25. So this harness plugs into the 4-wire sensor like so, and if we look at the other end of the harness, we can see that we have 2 black wires and 1 red wire. The 2 black wires attach to a ground point somewhere on the engine block or cylinder head, so that's easy. The red wire gets connected to a relay that provides 12 volts when the engine's running. So using this eBay harness and a few other wires, I ended up constructing a custom wire loom that fit the truck perfectly and would drop right into place. This loom included the relay and everything else necessary to get the 4-wire oxygen sensor to connect to the single-wire O2 sensor input on the factory harness. Since the entire exhaust system, including the manifolds, are from a 1994 S-10, well, this was the only cost-effective solution. Otherwise, I would have to locate an original 1989 exhaust manifold and do a lot more wrenching to get this O2 sensor to function correctly. The reason I went with a 4-wire sensor instead of a 3-wire sensor is simple. The 4-wire sensor is more common and is available at a reasonable price. However, the 3-wire sensor is not as common and costs a lot more. So it's simple economics. The only difference between a 3-wire and a 4-wire sensor is the 4-wire sensor has an extra ground wire, which can actually improve accuracy. Now that the engine is mostly sorted out, we need to deal with the tires and wheels so we can take the truck for a test drive. My first instinct was to visit the local junkyard and see what was available. And while there's plenty of S10s, nothing was actually worth grabbing. However, I did grab an air filter lid to replace the one that was modified for the CNG conversion. Now, on my way out of the junkyard, I spotted this Shelby Dodge Charger from the olden days. What a sad sight to see one of these just rotting away. Now, under the hood, meh, front-wheel drive sideways engine thingamajig. But back in the day, this was cutting-edge stuff. Shelby put his name on it, so that's good enough for me. Turbo. That looks like a furnace vent from my house. I wonder if Shelby got those from Home Depot. I'm sure this buggy will get rescued someday, but not today. Actually, I wouldn't mind doing a turbo diesel conversion on one of these, and I'm sure that would upset a lot of people. So the junkyard didn't provide us with the wheels that we needed. Now, I kind of like this vintage wagon wheel that's on the front of the truck, and it happens to be the only good tire and wheel on the truck. So I went ahead and picked up a set of wagon wheels and some discount tires from Walmart. These rims are actually hard to find nowadays, and these are Krager Nomads from Summit, and they weren't cheap, but I like them. So the truck now sits on a set of rims and fresh rubber. Nothing fancy, just the basics. Since this truck is 35 years old and has evidently never been cleaned, I went ahead and pulled the interior to give the floors a good scrubbing. The dirt that had accumulated throughout the years was thick, and it took a while to get the inside of this truck factory fresh. It's hard to believe something this old can still be in decent condition. As I recall, this truck only has 122,000 miles on it, and from the various bits of information I gleaned from the random papers I found, the truck's been sitting idle for many years. Unfortunately, the factory rubber floor mat was beyond saving. So I treated the truck to brand new carpet and brand new seat upholstery. The carpet is American made and it was sourced from Amazon. It took quite a bit of trimming in order to get it to fit properly, but it does fit. The seat upholstery was sourced from an online vendor that supplies replacement parts for various vintage trucks. The cover is awesome and I have zero complaints. However, the customer service was pure garbage and I likely won't be buying from them again. Now the floor mats, I'm real proud of these. These are vintage high-quality Rubbermaid units that I got at the scrapyard in Wichita, and they gave them to me for free, which is my favorite price. Overall, the interior is adequate for a simple no-frills truck, and I'll keep an eye out for a few odds and ends that may show up here and there in order to continue the restoration. Well, now that we have a comfortable seat and tires that hold air, it was finally time to take the truck out for its first test drive. And of course, we discovered more problems. So on the test drive, two big issues popped up. The first issue was the engine would misfire when it was idling in gear. The longer the engine idled in gear, the worse it ran. That was a head scratcher, but we did eventually figure that one out, and we'll get back to that in a few minutes. Anyway, the second big issue was, well, the fuel pressure felt like it was dropping when the truck accelerated. The longer we drove the truck, the less fuel pressure it had. Now, typically, fuel pressure issues can be identified by lack of power and engine stumble during acceleration. Of course, that's assuming everything else, like the ignition system and the catalytic converter, are in decent shape. Now, the exhaust back pressure before the converter was measured with this gauge, and the converter checked out fine. So, we started looking into the fuel system. Now we have a bit of a science experiment. What I've done here is, I put a jumper on the fuel pump relay to get the fuel pump running. And over here, I connected a hose to the fuel line that was connected to the throttle body. Now when we look at the fuel coming out of the fuel line, well, it's just a trickle, and most likely this is the result of a fuel filter being clogged. But if the filter clogged that quickly, then there must be a ton of debris in the tank. So, 6 bolts and a few wires later, we set up the engine hoist to remove the bed off the truck. This method is by far the easiest way to pull the bed off one of these little trucks. Now, according to the internet, it takes 2 people to lift the bed off the truck, but some effort is required. So the zero effort option is the one I prefer, and that's to use an engine hoist. Not too shabby. This, of course, is some kind of bug, and I'm not sure why it landed on the fuel tank. Anyway, when we look inside the fuel tank, we can see rust and a lot of crud. Now, I'm no expert, and to me it looks like this tank may have seen better days. At this point, it's not worth the effort to try to clean this, especially when new tanks can be had for just over $100. Fast forward yet another week, and the new tank and fuel pump have arrived. Of course, I'll also be replacing the fuel filter as well. So the fuel tank issue seems to be solved, and now I should probably rebuild the throttle body injector just in case any crap got into that thing. The throttle body on this engine and many other GM engines of this era are fairly simple and incorporate most of the components for the fuel injection system. The throttle body alone houses the injectors, the fuel pressure regulator, the idle air control, and the throttle position sensor. And that's most of the fuel injection system. The MAP sensor is not part of this assembly, but it's directly connected to it. And the only independent sensor is the engine coolant temperature sensor. Now this is interesting. On this era of fuel injection, well, there isn't an air intake temperature sensor. For some reason, GM didn't think that was necessary. Since we have a fresh fuel tank and a fresh fuel pump, rebuilding this thingy is the next logical step. The rebuild kit costs about $40, but that doesn't include new injectors. The old injectors can be cleaned and reused, and it's not mandatory that they be replaced. Anyway, I did find a lot of rust and fuel deposits inside this throttle body, and I was able to clean everything to factory fresh. So after replacing the fuel tank, the fuel pump, the fuel filter, and rebuilding the throttle body injection system, the engine ran so much better. Now this truck was making full power, and it went down the road with ease. The only problem was it still had a misfire at idle when the transmission was in gear. Now, when it was in neutral, well, the misfire would magically vanish. My best guess was we were looking at an ignition problem, but at this point, nearly everything in the ignition system was brand new. Now, in these older TBI systems, there's a special procedure to set the ignition timing, and you have to disconnect this wire inside the cab of the truck in order to set the base timing. So, I checked, double-checked, and triple-checked the base timing, and the timing was spot on. Just for giggles, I went ahead and pulled the distributor so I could have a closer look at the reluctor and the associated components. And what I found was the distributor was pretty much worn out and the reluctor was coming in contact with this pointy thingy. Now, there's supposed to be an air gap between these 2 points, and some magnetic resistance is normal, but parts crashing into each other is not normal, even on a GM vehicle. Now, on a Ford or even a Subaru, anything's possible, but back in the day, GM actually built some reliable stuff. Anyway, I picked up a cheapo distributor on Amazon, and the plan is to drop it in, and if it solves the problem, then we're golden. Now, the ignition control module on this guy may not be the best quality, so if this thing works, I'll go ahead and swap the ignition control module and keep this cheapo one in the glove box as a spare. Fast forward yet another few hours and the engine's running again, and best of all, the misfire is completely gone, which is awesome, but now I have a leaking water pump. Yep, this truck is definitely a keeper, and I reckon once I replace the water pump, well, there still may be a thing or two wrong with it. But now at least it's a running and driving truck. I really don't know how some people can get a car running and drive it halfway across the country. So far, this truck has taken me 2 months just to get it to this point, and I don't trust it to take it on a 20-mile trip yet. So when we look back, the one thing that remained constant throughout this adventure was the engine would misfire every time the transmission was put into any gear. It's possible that when the transmission was put into gear, the idle would drop low enough to trigger the misfiring due to the worn out distributor. So here's my theory. The misfire may have developed close to 20 years ago when this truck was still in California. Now, the fact that this truck's been modified with an aftermarket compressed natural gas system, well, it may have been close to impossible to have the truck serviced, mostly because an average mechanic wouldn't touch this vehicle with such a massive and undocumented modification. This would kind of explain why the truck only accumulated a little bit more than 10,000 miles since the early 2000s. I reckon with the engine running poorly, this truck wouldn't be able to pass smog, and perhaps it was just abandoned for close to 20 years. Kinda makes sense, because I did see a lot of problems that are normally associated to a vehicle that's been sitting a long time. That's just a theory based on the records that I found and the condition of the vehicle. Now, it's not clear how this thing got to Kansas, but the previous owner indicated he could never get the truck to run correctly, and he never drove it more than a few hundred feet. Well, that's all I got for today, and the truck battle will continue for as long as it takes to make this thing reliable, because, well, I have big plans for it. This video was certainly different than my usual antics with diesel engines and lawnmower-powered cars. Hopefully you found it interesting, and perhaps you learned something. We'll see you next time. Until then.